stop doing bad things.
Right?
Everyone.
Happy Thanksgiving weekend or week.
Yes. Stop doing bad things.
Nope, sorry, that's YouTube Live. Those of you who are hopping on, thank you so much. We will get started in just a few minutes. My office door doesn't close all the way, so my dog always just keeps sneaking in and opening the door.
You just need a very small dog. Like we have.
Right.
She's
I mean,
5 pounds and she can't figure out how to open anything.
Well, you know, I got a bigger dog, but his brain isn't super big, you know, it's just he's like got like a smooth brain. He's like a wizard. My husband and I always joke, we're like, there's just nothing behind those eyes.
Oh, he's so cute.
Yeah, he's smart in a lot of ways, and also not so smart in other ways. So I don't know, it's just the way it goes.
It is, especially for dogs.
Yeah. To those of you who are hopping on, thanks so much. We'll be starting in just about a minute. I think there are some of you joining on from Reddit, so thanks for registering, and whether that was from our cybersecurity or sysadmin, thanks so much. And we'll try to provide as much value as possible here in these 30 minutes. All right, just hit the 3:30, so I think we can get started here. Thanks again for joining, everyone. My name is Erica Mixon. I'm the content manager here at Blue Mira. I am joined by Matt Warner, who's the CTO and co-founder here at Blue Mira. Matt is the genius behind all of the detections and the vulnerability research that you see from us on our blogs. He has been instrumental in helping us develop the detections for these Microsoft vulnerabilities, and also communicating that out to our users as well as potential customers and just Windows users in general, administrators. So we're really happy to have him join us today. Today we'll be talking about a couple of the Microsoft vulnerabilities that came out of the most recent Patch Tuesday update. And yeah, we'll just get right into it. So, you know, just before Thanksgiving starts, of course, we've got a couple of vulnerabilities come our way. And, you know, I'm sure as administrators, you're all kind of hoping to chill out and relax on Thanksgiving. These are maybe your expectations. And then, of course, Microsoft hits us with this news, and maybe this is more of the reality that we're facing, unfortunately. But Matt, like I said, has been working hard in the Blue Mira lab, and we're going to give you some really sound advice to help you enjoy your holiday a little bit more and be able to relax. So let's just dive right into it. Matt, can you give a quick explanation as to the vulnerabilities that we'll be discussing today? I know that there are a few right now floating around, so let's just clear that up and make sure that there's no confusion.
Yeah, so today we'll be talking about two that are really most important because proof of concepts came out for these vulnerabilities, and or proof of concept came out for this first one, this LPE, that proved that the patch failed, which is by no means a new thing for Microsoft, especially in 2021. So we have this first one, which is a local privilege escalation vulnerability that has to do with a patch that came out previously as part of Patch Tuesday, but it's now been proven to be a failed patch. We'll talk about that a bit, as well as this remote code execution vulnerability for Exchange and Hybrid. That was patched earlier this month as well, I think November 9th. But we do have proof of concepts coming out as of the last 24 hours or so. So we wanted to make sure we touch base with that because it will be the most actively exploited thing in the next 24 to 72 hours here.
Awesome. Thanks for the explanation there. So both are pretty critical, it seems like, but if you needed to, let's say that you had some time constraints or resources restraints, is there one over the other that admin should be focusing on taking care of?
You must patch your Exchange servers. If you are in Exchange 2016 or 2019 in Hybrid, well, really in general, but especially if you are in Hybrid, you need to be updating and ensuring that you updated the patch from the 9th of November. So making sure that your Exchange server has been updated and making sure it's not stuck inside of change control or inside of your panel that handles any sort of your update process. We already are starting to see public exploitation of this, and we'll talk about it a little more, I'm sure, but it's one of those areas that you really want to make sure you're patching your Exchange as soon as possible. And if you haven't done this one yet, maybe you aim for end of month, maybe you have a process you're going through, that's time to hotwire that process and drop the patch into your Exchange servers.
All right, that's great advice. Thanks, Matt. And just so everyone knows, you can feel free to drop in the chat or the Q&A throughout these 30 minutes here if you have any questions. I know that these zero-day vulnerabilities can generate a lot of confusion, especially when the Microsoft communication is sometimes a little sparse. So feel free to drop those questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we can try to answer those for you in real time. So how bad is this, Matt? You kind of alluded to this earlier, but if you would have to describe the severity of these two vulnerabilities, how would you describe that?
So the LP, the privilege escalation, is a pretty moderate severity issue. It's really more one of those areas that I'm sure anyone who's been watching and managing their Windows environments has noticed that 2021 has just been more and more and more local privilege escalation vulnerabilities inside of Windows. And if you haven't patched Print Nightmare properly or Hive Nightmare properly or any of the other, I think there's like 5 or 6 that came out this year, this is just another one that you really have to make sure you have full coverage across your environment to ensure that someone can't just drop into your machine and get LP on it. It's not a highly critical vulnerability because it does require local access or require someone to drop a file into your environment as well. So it does require a number of stages for them to be successful and actually leverage it. However, it's another area in your environment where if it's not patched and an attacker gets into your environment, it'll be another tool that they can leverage to get further into that environment. There are a few hitches with the LP vulnerability that make it a little less critical, we'll say, and a little harder to leverage and a little harder for the attacker to do more with. That's probably the best way to put that. And really the reason that it is that way is because this vulnerability, the LP, isn't necessarily just a you spawn a command shell and then you get another command shell and all of a sudden it's system. It's really more modifying the actual permissions of a file when that MSI installer, which was the original vulnerability associated with this, which Microsoft thought they had patched, and it allows you to modify the actual permissions of a file even if you did not have permissions to it. So you can take full access permissions to command shell, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the user is going to be able to execute a system. What it does do is it allows an attacker to do things like modify the permissions of the Hive files inside of your shadow and pull those files out and dump the credentials. So you have like a modified Hive nightmare almost, where it doesn't matter that the files are no longer accessible because they fixed that. Now someone can drop this file down and just change those files to be fully accessible by that user. So it's not the most critical thing in the world, and it's not fixable, to be quite honest. It's not patched yet. The patch failed. There's no workaround for it. So it's just something you really need to monitor for and look for behaviors associated with, just generally speaking. And I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Matt.
Okay. Sorry, I can go on forever, as Erica knows well. And the Exchange RCE, the remote code execution, is patched, but that doesn't mean that it has been patched by everyone. So it's something that's really important for everyone to start to make sure you get your patches across. The POC is out. And the POC is really clean and it makes sense. And I won't be surprised as we see it weaponized more across the environment. It is only 4 posts into your Exchange environment. It is a really straightforward attack. However, it does require authentication, and there's some debate on if MFA stops this at all, just generally speaking. So it does require someone to know how to get into your environment and be able to authenticate into your environment. But once they can do that, it's a really easy path to execution on your Exchange server. It is not execution at system unless your Exchange is running a system at IIS. It's just execution as usually like the default app pool, but it does allow remote code execution directly into that environment if it is authenticated. So it'll be really important to patch, because if you think about what we see right here, there's nothing stopping an attacker from executing this RCE, getting the chain into the environment, dropping a file like that we're seeing here into the environment, pulling your Hive files down, dumping your credentials, and then moving forward across your environment. So it's as we kind of talk about, it's continuing to expand the attack surface of your environment and making it more risky. So definitely patch. It's actively in the wild. People are using this to attack, which means that it's now going to be those APT-ish, like really advanced attackers using it. And then it's going to be your ransomware operators in the next 72 to a week, 72 hours to a week of time for them to start operationalizing it.
Right. And we saw that with Print Nightmare, right? Where it wasn't in the wild at first, but then ransomware operators started to use that to gain access into systems. And I believe that's still happening, correct?
Print Nightmare, proxy login, and really any vulnerability that can be leveraged right now, we're seeing every operator just add it to their playbook. Because if you think about like when you get a pen test, or when you're just doing your day-to-day, anything that they or any of us can leverage to make our jobs easier, they're going to do, and the operators do it just the same because there's a lot of money behind it.
Right. It's a no-brainer for ransomware operators, unfortunately.
Yep.
And you had mentioned earlier that, in 2021, we're kind of seeing more of these exploits. Why do you think that is, if you had to, make any predictions? And I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, Matt, so no worries if you don't have any thoughts on this.
I don't think there's a specific reason. I think it's a mix of a few different components. There are more people doing bug bounty research. There are more people wanting to be just generally interested in pivoting away from maybe software engineering into bug bounty and research, just generally speaking. A lot of the things that we're seeing across these Windows environments are not new issues. They're just newly found issues. And anyone who's been in software engineering knows that it's impossible to write perfect things. You just kind of have to write your code as best as you can. You have to put boundaries around it. You have to do what you can to make it successful. But when you have something as large as Windows, and it seems like anything Microsoft related, but especially Windows, we just can kind of continuously see this breaking apart of either legacy issues that kind of get brought up by bug bounty researchers or just research groups in general, or we are starting to see people that are really making concerted efforts to identify weak areas in Windows and leverage them in a way that's useful. So it's a number of different kind of components, and really all of it kind of goes back to, it's really hard to make something perfectly secure. If anyone could do it, you would hope it would be Microsoft. But if you think about like this Microsoft patch for Exchange, this was a serialization change they made in Exchange. It made it even worse, and it opened a vulnerability into the environment, and they then had to go back and fix it. And that's just kind of the inevitability of software engineering. And I'm sure some people would say, and also it's a benefit because Exchange Online isn't impacted, but it is impacted your on-prem Exchange. So it's also kind of this push into the cloud, which is, you could talk conspiracy theories about for a very long time if you like to.
Yeah, I'm sure you could. And it probably doesn't help, with the ZeroDay vulnerability. At least the security researcher that published the POC code for that was a disgruntled researcher who was upset about Microsoft lowering the bug bounty. So,
Yes.
I'm sure that doesn't help either.
No, yeah, it's a wild world now in that regard, for
Absolutely.
sure.
Yeah. So let's get into some advice here that we can give to our attendees. Matt, do you mind talking through, what your recommendations would be for the 0-day LPE vulnerability?
Sure, yeah. And we have a blog post up that has all these details as well, so you don't have to necessarily remember all the random things I say. There are a few different ways to detect the 0-day LP being used, the POC being used inside of your environment. Again, there was a patch for this. The patch failed. It was not a successful patch, just generally speaking. So it'll be important for people to monitor for this until there's a patch in place. Enable Sysmon if you haven't. For those of you who have large Windows environments, Sysmon's really invaluable to get visibility from like an EDR perspective without needing to depend on the EDR to get what you want of your endpoint visibility solution. And just generally use that endpoint solution in conjunction with a SIM, something that you can actually leverage to get alerts out of. Will be really important, and we'll talk a bit about the alerts. And the blog post talks about a number of different ways you can detect this. It's a really loud vulnerability and exploit when it's being leveraged. There are a bunch of ways that you can detect it. And for those of you who do this already, though you're doing any sort of safe listing or allowing only certain binaries on the host, that will immediately stop this threat because it requires a new file to be dropped onto the host as well. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. I was just trying to say that, with Blumera, we developed Poshim. Well, you developed Poshim,
Yep.
the PowerShell script that enables you to immediately configure and install Sysmon and NXLog within your environment. So that should certainly make things easier when it comes to enabling Sysmon. And I can drop
Yes.
the link to that blog post as well in the comments. So as far as detections go with the 0-day, because, like you said, there is no patch for this currently. So you're kind of just solely relying on detections to protect your environment. So let's talk a little bit about what you can do there, Matt.
Sure, yeah. And to start, Defender, as well as many AAV applications, will see essentially the file that has to be built and dropped. So if you are leveraging Defender, Defender for Enterprise, or whatever they're calling it these days, Defender for Endpoint, as well as among a number of other AVs, you'll see signature hits for this. So it is a pretty hard one to properly land generally. However, that just goes to it being a noisy POC. With Sysmon, the default POC has a hard-coded path inside of it. So if you're attackers that are lazy and they're just taking the file and then leveraging it, Microsoft Please is in that path. I assume related to trying to get a bug bounty out of Microsoft. It's always there. There are going to be logs associated with Microsoft Please as a path as it pertains to the temp file when this MSI is executed, or when the exploit is executed associated with MSI, I should say. It also moves and deletes SPL-wow.64.exe in its own kind of app data temp folder as the MSI is installing and it's actually changing the permissions of a file. It moves this file around inside of temp. And in our testing, it looks to be a very accurate way to detect the behavior associated with this kind of attack. There are a few other hard-coded strings. Test package, PKG, is leveraged inside of the MSI itself. So the way this attack works is you basically hand it an MSI and then you wrap it inside of an EXE. That's where it does all its fun exploitation of this vulnerability. So when you actually run it, you'll get the MSI output inside of your event logs that will say like finished running test package. And that allows you to really get a quick visibility into someone is running this exact thing. If you, of course, have your own MSIs that you call test package, that can overlap with your own stuff. But generally speaking, in our testing, it's a really quick and easy way to detect this has happened. It detects it at the tail end, I should say. It doesn't detect it at the beginning, but it does detect that it's happened. The other big one in our testing that it looks to be really accurate is when you have a system user, so the proper system ID, the S1518, where they are referencing inside of the message your actual user's temp app data. and it will be on a failed MSI install. And the blog post you see there also has the details for this. That one's really accurate in my testing so far, and it should get you detection even after someone will inevitably go and change the way this POC works. Those hard-coded paths no longer exist. The MSI still needs to leverage that user's temp app data. It still needs to leverage kind of the way Microsoft functions. And that should allow you to get good visibility in between that sysmon SPL WoW 64, as well as just normal Windows logs. I think it's the application log, looking at when a system user is referencing a user's kind of MSI interactions inside of that environment. In our testing, it's really accurate. Even if you strip out those hard-coded paths, it still has to interact at that level on the host. So you should still be able to see visibility into that environment.
That's great. Thank you, Matt. And any insight on the application event log? I know that was not necessarily something that we did. Were you able to test that in our lab?
Yeah, that's the same idea as the hard-coded strings that we saw with Microsoft Please as well. So the test package you can see inside of 1033 for application event log. That's essentially just your event log that states like MSI status. So any of you are looking for the ability to like track MSI installs across my host, 1033 is the one you're looking for to do that. Because of the way this exploit works, you also can see the fact that test package MSI was leveraged just because of the nature of how Microsoft works. The issue is that the moment that like proper quote unquote attackers come into here, they're going to strip out that Microsoft Please, they're going to strip out test package, they're going to call it something like Microsoft Word.msi, and it's going to get a lot harder to do hard-coded string detection, which is why you'll want to look at kind of like references across app data, references across SPL WoW, that kind of thing.
Got it.
But for the POC, it works great.
Exactly. It's awesome. All right. So those are the detections that, we covered again in the blog post, and we will share that as well. So you don't have to, like Matt said, follow along so closely to this. And for the CVE that came out, let's discuss that, Matt. It's fortunate that the Microsoft patch addresses pretty much everything that would be risky related to that vulnerability. Is that correct?
Yes, the Microsoft patch, and as far as we can tell, and as far as the community can tell, does properly resolve this issue. A WAF would probably also halt the attack because of the way that this is working. But yes, definitely you want to make sure you get your November patches in for all of your Exchange servers immediately.
All right. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, someone didn't have the ability to patch, or, didn't have the time. Let's hope they do, that is a priority. But, if that patch isn't able to be installed, there are some detections that you've come up with. Do you mind discussing those a little bit?
Yeah, so the way that this POC works, it's a gadget chain, if you want to talk about kind of offensive terminology. And basically the way that it works is it makes 4 different posts into your Exchange environment that requires an authenticated user. And it essentially preps a number of areas in your environment. So it creates a user configuration, it preps that user configuration with the payload inside of who knows why this is added. And I'm sure there are a bunch of great reasons, called binary data and the actual user configuration. And then when you get the token for this user, it executes the binary data on the Exchange host itself as it deserializes that binary data. This was the vulnerability that was introduced in an Exchange change as part of a hybrid Exchange environment. It is really impactful just because of the nature of how it works. It really just requires that authenticated connection and 4 posts into your environment. The benefit at this point, however, is that the POC that was released today has a hard-coded user agent that you can see right here. In our testing, we ran us across hundreds of customers. We did not see one false positive match here. So if you are able to get your IS logs, so essentially your logs associated with your Exchange server on IS. They're really easy to get out there. We have an article out there about extracting your IS logs, and you can see posts from public IPs, so probably a public IP, it could be private, but public IPs with this user agent. You can be pretty sure that this POC is being run against your environment. All the attacker has to do is change the payload in the POC to be whatever they want it to do. Right now it pops MS Paint, which is not really relevant to most people, but it would be really easy for attackers to just flip that out for another thing. It's more than likely they will change the user agent at one point, but as it pertains to the existing POC that is there, and for people to be able to detect how this is working, this is how you want to do it. The other direction you really want to start to move in, because the way that we kind of look at this, and at least the way that I kind of look at this, is you're never going to stay ahead of IS logs for Exchange vulnerabilities. Like, you can detect them with web shells, of course, that's really the best way to do it, but doing it purely off of like post get on your IS server is really hard to do. Like, you can do it, and this works right now, but the moment that someone changes your user agent, you're going to get into a place where you're trying to combat, like, well, what user agents do we use versus what are they doing versus how is this functioning in my environment? And the easiest way to really do this, because you're not going to stop them before post, this is like 25 seconds of effort realistically by the attacker, is to detect when the actual IES W3WP.exe service is communicating to command or PowerShell. That's where we at Blumira tend to get the most benefit of detecting attacks against Exchange, because you can detect some things, but realistically, most of these modern attacks are going to be 1 to 4 calls, and they're going to have some sort of execution on the host. And realistically, you're better off detecting using Sysmon to detect when that parent process is IIS and it's communicating with command or communicating with PowerShell, and someone is actually pivoting across your environment. Those are really going to be your best bet. And also, you'll have the most longevity for detection, because you're always going to want to know when IES is spawning a command shell. It's always important, whereas it's not necessarily always important that this pattern is seen. However, we can tell you with pretty damn good surety that if you have this detection in place, you will see when someone runs a PSE against your environment, and they could just drop in a new payload and it will work just fine, so long as they're authenticated with the user.
That's really good to know. Thanks for that information, Matt. And, it's pretty much impossible for everyone to keep up with all the vulnerabilities that we're dealing with Microsoft. And just in general, it's vulnerability tracking and management is pretty much impossible, especially if you're tasked with other IT administrative responsibilities. That's why at Blumira, we threat hunt on your behalf. So that is really helpful. And, we create detections, Matt and his team create detections in real time to protect you against vulnerabilities like this, because you're just going to be, chasing your tail and going in circles if you are trying to track every vulnerability and develop detections on your own for that. So that's kind of, where Blumira really comes in handy is, also centralizing those logs too, because if you're just tracking those Sysmon events and the event logs in Windows Event Viewer, you're going to go crazy, right? Especially on like a Thanksgiving weekend where you're just trying to relax with your friends and family. You don't want to be checking Windows Event Viewer every 2 seconds to make sure that there's not a attacker within your environment, right? So that's also, where centralizing those logs and using a SIM like Blumira really comes in handy as well. Matt, do you have any other information on, how Blumira can help and, how the free trial works specifically?
Yeah, so here at Blumira, we push really hard on getting people the most visibility possible and making sure that they don't have to sink time into threat hunting and they can really get value out of their data. Part of that is that we don't limit the amount of data that people send, which is to say, like, deploy POSHM everywhere, send us Sysmon and all your system logs, and we'll show you what we need to show you so you can get value out of your environment. But also, we really want people to test the SIM. We really want people to kind of prove to themselves as well as us that they're getting what they want out of that SIM. So please come try out Blumira. But either way, please check out our blog and try out our detections for these vulnerabilities. They should work out well for you. And we're always here to help.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for not only developing those detections today. I know you were working, round the clock today to make sure that those detections were developed, and also that you communicated that out to the security community in general. So I really appreciate that. I know that others do as well. And we can't thank you enough for your contributions here and for also hopping on this webinar. I don't see any questions so far, but if you have any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. But otherwise, I'm glad we made this short and sweet, and hopefully we were able to provide some value, again, so you can relax and enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday without having to worry whether, a threat actor is in your environment due to these Windows vulnerabilities. So thank you so much for joining, everyone, and thank you, Matt, for joining us and sharing your expertise here.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks, everyone. And